These days, it's generally accepted that for any given game, the PC version will be prettier than the Xbox One X version, which will be prettier than the PS4 Pro version, and so on down, while basically being the same game. And if you want portable, you buy it on the Nintendo Switch, the only currently commercially viable handheld. But in the last century, things were different. Games on different formats might be written by different teams. Consoles and computers had massively different capabilities, and sometimes different requirements by the platform holders. And sometimes, such as with Disney's Aladdin, 3 entirely independent actual games would get released. But it's 2019, and whether by emulation, eBay, or just modern remakes, if you decide to play a game, you have your pick of the lot. So what you need to know is, on what should I play? Pac-Man. I don't know a lot about you, valued YouTube viewer, but I do know you almost certainly already know Pac-Man. Despite the existence of Sonic, Mario, and of course Stan, it's Pac-Man that more people recognise than any other video game character. In a survey, only 6% of Americans couldn't identify him. And that's in a country where over a quarter of people refuse to accept the Earth orbits the Sun. And not because they think it orbits Pac-Man. But if you fancy a quick go on Toru Iwatani's seminal masterpiece, where do you go? Pac-Man is very solidly a game from the era where arcade-to-home conversions were a tricky business. And boy have there been a lot of home conversions, on everything from the original Atari 2600 right up to the Game Boy Color nearly 20 years later. And then a second life begun as part of retro compilations. It's part of the first Namco Museum on PS1, and then subsequently on N64, Dreamcast, PlayStation 2, GameCube and Xbox. It's in Namco Museum 50th anniversary for those last 3 as well, a significant version as it's the first official home way to play the actual arcade game emulated, rather than a reworked port. It's on Namco Museum Virtual Arcade for 360, on Namco Museum Essentials for the PS3, on Namco Museum Mega Mix for the Wii, on Namco Museum Doesn't Have a Subtitle for the Switch Digital Store, and Namco Museum Arcade Pack for the Switch in cartridge form. There's also one more wildcard I'd like to suggest, but let's get to that at the end. There's very few remotely famous video game platforms that haven't had an official version of Pac-Man at some point. And the ones that haven't probably have got a legally distinct clone. World of Spectrum, for instance, lists more than 100 of them just for that machine, ranging from the era-defining Hungry Horace to the "Dear God, how did we not get turbo-sued" Pac-Man. Yes, this was a commercial release a year after Atari's own Spectrum conversion. You could get away with that kind of thing in 1985. There's very much a video in someone trying to play all surviving 90 or so versions, but it is not going to be this video. We're prepared to stick our necks out and suggest the definitive way to play Pac-Man in 2019 is not going to be a homebrew author's attempt on the Spectrum. In general, we can tip the very early official home ports over the edge here as well, but I can't let us move on without highlighting this. The attempt to port it to the poor old Atari VCS, also known as the 2600. For various exciting technical reasons, the 2600 is a mess with multiple moving objects, to the extent that clever programmers gained the location of the beam that draws the image on a CRT TV in order to get anything much moving at all. And the 2600 suffers from this. It draws most of the enemies on only some frames in order to make it work even slightly. It's in many ways heroic, and if you have a 2600, it's a game you must own just to experience it. And by it, I mean empathy for the poor buggers that played the game in the arcade and then spent £38 on this flickery, glitchy mess of a game in 1982. That's pretty much 3 figures now. Even the iconic startup theme couldn't be found room for. But also have empathy for Todd Fry, who wrote the whole thing single-handedly in 4 months, with half the cartridge size he asked for, and with a full quarter of the pathetic internal memory of the 2600 given over to keeping track of Player 2's score. Todd would get a medal for bravery for the attempt if that were the kind of thing the game industry did. Still, there's significant downgrades, even if you ignore the flickering. Todd tried every trick to squeeze this out at all. Pac-Man can't turn vertically, for instance. The Ghost's AI is simpler. The maze is designed so the walls and pills are actually made of the exact same graphic. The sound is massively cut down. The maze design is dramatically altered and is now widescreen, and there was even only room for one fruit, which is a vitamin for some reason. Somehow, this version sold 7 million copies, making it very comfortably the best-selling game ever for the system. It would have been a huge financial success for Atari if they hadn't made the slight technical mistake of manufacturing 12 million cartridges. If you're wondering if there were even 12 million consoles in existence then no. No, there was not. Luckily for Todd, his slightly stingy 10 cents royalty on each copy was paid out for copies manufactured, not sold, making him a millionaire overnight. I'm not going to begrudge him that one at all. Whether his experiences with Pac-Man led to his later career in artificial intelligence is a question I'm not even going to try and ask him. This, unsurprisingly, is not our answer. Fun? Yeah. Historically interesting? Certainly. But this is not the definitive way to play Pac-Man. This is a British show. For our American viewers, that's why all the prices are in pounds and you have an inexplicable urge to trust everything I say. It's also why our next step is the British home computers. We mentioned the Spectrum earlier, and that certainly had a version, as did the C64. Not the CPC though, which, being the latest released of the three famous rivals, missed the boat for an official version. For expediency, we're also skipping versions here for Atari's 8-bit computers and the VIC-20. You're watching the Spectrum port, and it's a damn fine attempt mostly. It runs well enough, it controls largely well enough, it's got a recognisable maze, and even the Ghost AI is just about intact. If you bought this for the Spectrum having played the arcade machine, I think you'd be rather pleased. In fact, it's good enough that I wonder what exactly the point of the subsequent 80-odd versions for the machine were. They're probably not doing much better on the machine than AtariSoft did with their attempt. There's not even any colour clash or anything. Plus, of course, on release, it cost a quarter of the price of that 2600 cart. Although, it would be nice if someone explained to me why, on a machine with a keyboard, it wants me to enter my name on the high score table with cursor keys. The C64 one I actually like less. It's somehow got rectangular pills again, thanks to the maze being weirdly stretched. I've also never really been a fan of the C64's very muted colour palette, especially for an arcade game like Pac-Man. That said, predictably, for the more powerful machine, it does have a better frame rate. Less predictably, I think the sound's actually worse. Still, again, you'd be pretty pleased with this if you came from playing seaside arcades. Now though, if you're gonna play an 8-bit home computer one, make it the Specky. Moving to the consoles, there's similar timing-based issues. The Atari 5200 got a version, as did the NES, but the Sega Master System did not. The NES version seems the obvious candidate, and it certainly looks and sounds the part. That's the best attempt at the Pac-Man theme we've heard so far. And the maze is the correct shape, as are the pills and ghosts. It's got the intro with the ghost names, and it moves very well too. Weirdly though, it's unresponsive. I ditched several video captures as unless I held the buttons down like I was trying to demand it confess to a crime, I sailed merrily past turns I wanted to make and right into a ghost hug. Which is considerably less pleasant than it sounds. Given this would have been a £40 cart game, then I actually think you'd be annoyed. More than graphics, arcade conversions of these times needed to feel like the arcade. They needed to respond like the arcade. And the NES version, disappointingly, doesn't. Leaving our only remaining original home console option as Atari's own 5200 then. And no. It exercises the demons of that 2600 nightmare at least. It doesn't flicker, it moves well, but the maze is the wrong shape. The sound is pretty awful, and it's barely more responsive than that NES version. This is one of those times where the home computers take the consoles out the back and give them a well-deserved kicking. It might well have been different if Sega's 8-bit hero had got a crack, but we never found out. Although there is a clue. While the Master System remained resolutely un-Pac-Manned, the Game Gear got one. And this is it. You see the problem immediately, of course. The stage doesn't fit on the screen. The Game Gear's legendarily low resolution strikes again. To very roughly define, if you have a modern 1080p monitor, TV or laptop, and you probably do, you could play 100 Game Gears on that screen in their native resolution at once. If you have a 4K TV, it's about 400. Or, to put it another way, if you have a very modern TV, you could play every single game they ever made for the Game Gear on the same screen at once without losing any detail whatsoever. We saw this making Sonic the Hedgehog a problem back in the first episode, and here it's even more of a killer. You just can't play Pac-Man unless you know where the ghosts are and what pills you have left uneaten. It's a shame, because otherwise this would have been a decent effort. A Master System version that was identical to this without the scrolling, and we've no reason to think it wouldn't have been, would probably have been the best thing so far. Same issue with the monochrome Game Boy too, with the neat added bonus that they haven't even tried to make the ghosts look different. If you're an idiot like us, this isn't a major issue, but arcade experts will tell you that the ghosts in Pac-Man actually have distinct personalities. This isn't even an urban legend. Blinky, the red one, chases Pac-Man. Pinky, the pink one, tries to cut him off. This is one of the main ways you can find yourself trapped between the two of them. Inky, the blue one, tends to aim for fixed points in the maze, and Clyde alternates between chasing like Blinky and simply running towards the lower left of the maze when Pac-Man gets close. All of which is to say, if the Game Boy one is doing this, you can't tell. If you're an expert, you can't plan, and the scrolling issues mean that, whoever you are, you shouldn't be playing this version. Same goes for the Game Boy Color Special Color Edition, which changes absolutely nothing as far as I can tell, apart from those colours. Special colours. So there's no good period handheld version. If you must play a Pac-Man game on an old handheld, the best I can do is point you at Ms. Pac-Man on the Atari Lynx. It's hideous looking and sounding, but it does at least fit the entire maze on the screen, as you can see in this clip courtesy of World of Long Plays. Normally, it's easy to divide what you'd call era-correct ports of games, and later retro-market re-releases. In Pac-Man's case, there's been virtually no let-up in versions of this game getting released for things. I'd say this though is the dividing line. We've reached the end of the period where the capabilities of the machine in any way determined how a version turned out, and into the era where the differentiator is very much the skill and commitment of the team on the project. We're also where, by and large, people stopped trying to sell Pac-Man as a game on its own and folded it into compilations. I mention this because we do have another handheld option, if we're prepared to accept a game released in a compilation 21 years after the arcade machine to count as an era-correct port. Given our crappy selection up to now for portable players, I'm making the executive decision to allow the Game Boy Advance Pac-Man collection. And I'm just going to let this intro play out, because I don't think I've heard a lounge version of the Pac-Man theme before. But do we get a full screen version? You beauty. In fact, it's given us the choice should you want it. You can see why. It's pretty small on a GBA screen, with the whole thing in as perfectly illustrated by me scaling these all up to fill your screen regardless. Okay, for this section, please sit an extra 45 feet away from your screen, Tarloves. And in full screen, this GBA version will do very nicely, thank you. It's a great vanilla version of Pac-Man with no major failings, and so we can happily move on knowing retro handheld owners at least had an option. In scroll mode, this looks as you'd expect. It plays exactly the same, but I still maintain scrolling doesn't work. Which is a shame, because there's another little gem on here. A modern jazz-up by the name of Pac-Man Arrangement, which adds new graphics to the mix, as well as an extra ghost, and, as the game goes on, special tiles like the dash. It does not have a full screen mode, however. Even so, it's an entertaining diversion and well worth a play if you have the Pac-Man collection. The only major disadvantage of this whole collection is it doesn't save high scores. Arrangement is an arcade port, which originally appeared in a coin-op by the name of Namco Classic Collection Volume 2 in 1996. That same year, the long-running Namco Museum series appeared, almost all of which feature Pac-Man. It's a little galling to realise this series, with its carefully curated collections of games and excellent extras, had already started on PS1 by the time Game Boy Color owners were being forced to pay full price to play a quarter of a game of Pac-Man at a time. Namco Museum, in its original 6-volume run on PS1, took the museum part seriously. The games including exhibits like these, showing the history of the games and some of the merchandising that was sold around them. I love this kind of thing. Even if you don't play Pac-Man on this, you should get these and just have a tour. Yeah, you could probably stick the whole thing on a website now, but it really doesn't beat strolling around seeing everything, even in this resolution. Actually, someone get hold of Unity or Unreal Engine and remake just the museum bits of these. That'd be bloody superb. Great, now there's yet another thing I want to make when they invent infinite time. Ooh, and do them in VR. You should possibly play the actual games here though. We're still just about in the era where games were being recreated rather than just emulated, but that doesn't matter because this PS1 version is our best so far. It's in the right aspect ratio, it runs well, it's got the sounds, and the level doesn't bloody well scroll. The PS1 controller has a fairly decent D-pad to boot too. The Namco Museum series continued with versions for the 64, Dreamcast and Game Boy Advance. Presumably thanks to trying to sell that Pac-Man collection, the GBA version does not include Pac-Man. Sadly, none of them from here on out include that lovely proper museum mechanic either. By all accounts, they're also fine, being recreations rather than emulated versions, but being done well enough that that doesn't matter too much. This also applies to the PSP version. As an aside, the PSP version, known as Battle Collection, has a game called Pac-Man Arrangement. This is not the same as the one we've already seen, but was an original interpretation of the same idea for PSP. Also in things to be aware of, the PS2, GameCube and Xbox all have 2 Namco museums. Pac-Man is on both, I have neither. But this, thanks to Rio Game Station, is the first one. This is the last Namco Museum release where they recreated rather than emulated the games, and it was done by the same team that handled that GBA version. It very much appears to be the exact same code ported. And if so, and if you already have this title at the bottom of a drawer, then it'll be a perfectly good way to go about things. And then consider selling it. It's so rare CEX's website doesn't believe it exists. We're going to skip a little now. From this point on, all the Namco museums simply emulate the arcade machine, and it's old enough that that's a well-solved problem. On the PS2 etc., that means the second release, known as Namco Museum 50th Anniversary, but also any of the versions on later machines. Possibly because they were just doing emulation, at this point we've pretty much stopped seeing the arrangement games making an appearance. The only one I know of is that 360 release shown here, known as Namco Museum Virtual Arcade. This is a good pack to track down. It has virtually all the Pac-Man games, including one I'm saving till last, so I won't mention now. Over the years I've played a lot of the emulated versions, this included, and they're all basically identical as you'd expect. So if you can get hold of any Namco museum after 50th Anniversary, or any of the releases on say Xbox Live Arcade, you're probably gold. Pick your favourite controller basically. This is already a pretty lengthy guide, so we're only going to play 2 of the emulator based versions. The first is the easiest available handheld solution today, the Switch version, known as Namco Museum Arcade Pack in physical form and just Namco Museum on the eShop. They differ by a couple of games, but both versions have the exact same Pac-Man, and it's a pretty nice one. Here's how you know it's a nice one. It doesn't let me use the Switch's internal video capture option because Namco are turbo dicks, and yet I'm showing it to you. It's perfectly emulated, and playing this shortly after versions like the Spectrum or even the PS1, there's certainly a difference. It's lovely looking, super smooth and super responsive. This is the peak of old school Pac-Man, because it's arcade perfect, old school Pac-Man. Better than perfect really. The Switch of course is the handheld that lets you remove the controllers, and this version takes huge advantage of this by allowing you to rotate the screen and play Pac-Man in the correct portrait orientation, using the Switch's full screen. It's a really nice touch, as is the challenge mode, where you have to eat as many ghosts as possible in 3 minutes. Perhaps because it's emulated, it doesn't change the levels or gameplay to give you extra power pills for this. You'll still need to finish the level to replenish them, but it's a nice extra, and an idea we'll see them expand on in a minute. I believe the only official current way to buy Pac-Man on PC is the Pac-Man Museum, available on Steam. Sonic the Hedgehog is playing it here, and to me it's fairly obviously the same emulated version as the other systems. Nothing wrong with that. I'm not buying it to check because I already own the best game in the pack anyway and it's just an emulator. As an aside, the elephant in the room of arcade ports on PC is always the arcade emulator MAME, and has been for well over 20 years. We try to avoid advocating non-legal routes to play these games where possible in this series, but you should know that Pac-Man runs perfectly well on MAME. Here we're using the original Japanese version where he was called Pac-Man. And if you can't work out why it was a good idea to change that name before putting it on an English-speaking arcade cabinet, then I can only assume you have never been 12 years old. Here's a novelty. Virtually everyone knows Google's Doodles. They're the daily updated logo changes Google makes, usually to celebrate a particular milestone. And so it came to pass that back on the 20th of May 2010, Pac-Man's 30th anniversary, Google chose to celebrate Pac-Man in such a fashion. Not with a static picture though. The Doodle, which can still be accessed by searching Google Doodle Pac-Man, is a fully playable one-level implementation of Pac-Man, and it's very nice. We're not going to kid you, this is the definitive version, but it's free, works on everything, and neatly fulfills this episode's version no bugger has ever heard of quotient. Mobile, there are Android and iOS variants as you might expect, and we might as well cover them using my trusty iPad Pro. Pac-Man iOS is, on the surface of it, pretty reasonable. You will of course have worried when you saw it was free, and you'd be justified. The main payback comes in the form of adverts which play after each game. That feels like a small imposition. Call it the equivalent of putting another quarter in the machine. The game, however, includes missions to earn coins. These coins can of course be added to by watching adverts or buying in bulk for money. They can be used to unlock new mazes to play on, or to continue from where you left off when you lose. The game is pretty relentless with its advertising for these, but not too off-puttingly. So how good a Pac-Man is it? Well, actually a really good one. You could play it just like the arcade game if you liked, and the swipe to move mechanic is about as good as it could have been, only rarely not doing what I wanted it to. You're not going to play a perfect game with it of course, but it's easily quick go on the train level. Very pleasingly, it will let you play offline, albeit without being able to finish missions, so playing on a train is actually a thing. With the maps, the checkpointing, and some surprisingly excellent behind-the-scenes style tips for Pac-Man in general about ghost behaviour, this is well worth having on your device. Definitive, it isn't, but you tell me that you wouldn't have appreciated it on your last public transport journey. There's a second mobile version you should look up. There was a Wreck-It Ralph tie-in called Ralph Breaks the Maze. It's very clearly a cut-down version of the main game, with extra mazes only unlockable for cash. Quite a lot of cash. But we suggest you just stick with the free first level, which is normal Pac-Man, except Felix keeps building walls in your way and Ralph keeps knocking them down. Given that's again free, it's a nice little diversion. There is supposed to be a Facebook Messenger version of Pac-Man you can play with your friends, but it doesn't appear in any list of games I managed to access, and then I realised I was trying to play games on bloody Facebook and had a long word with myself. That's all the strictly qualifying entries, but there is one more interesting option, if you know your Pac-Man history, and in 30 seconds you will. The original creator, Toru Iwatani, never worked on any of the Pac-Man sequels other than a vague overseer role on Pac-Mania. And indeed Namco never really saw him as any kind of game superstar in the same way as, say, Shigeru Miyamoto is at Nintendo. He was promoted into management and administration at Namco in 1987 or so, and didn't see another game for 20 years. In 2007 though, Iwatani decided to retire from Namco to become a university lecturer, having been doing that part-time for the previous few years. First though, he wanted to work on one last project, a true successor to the original Pac-Man. You could call it a sequel, you could call it a modern remake, but what Namco called it was Pac-Man Championship Edition. Pac-Man CE feels like the one true sequel. For a start, it predicted esports way ahead of the curve. The main modes involve not lives, but 5-minute timed battles with more and more ghosts heading your way. Instead of transitioning between levels, part of the maze is filled with pills and sleeping ghosts. Get the pills and another section is filled in. Meanwhile, more and more of the ghosts start following you. When your resolve cracks, grab a power pill and cash in massive bonuses. All the while, the speed and your ability to score increases. Die, and some of that bonus goes away, plus you just cost yourself valuable time. It's got 5-minute modes, it's got 10-minute modes. It gets incredibly fast. It gets you back in the action immediately you die. In many ways, it feels like more of an arcade game than the arcade game and its slower pace does these days. It's an actual masterpiece. There is a sequel to Pac-Man CE, called exactly what you think it's going to be called. There's no reason you shouldn't play that instead, there's nothing wrong with it, it expands a little on the formula, etc. But Toru wasn't involved in that. He remained true to his word that CE would be his last game, and for us, that makes the difference. If we're looking for the ultimate version of Pac-Man, it feels only right that it be one that the original creator worked on and blessed. You can get CE on that Xbox 360 Namco Museum I mentioned, as well as on PC, either on its own or part of the Pac-Man Museum. It also appears on the PSP, PS3, iOS, Android, and 3DS. You were watching the PC version for ease of video capturing just now, but I also played the 360 version. The DX version you see on some of those platforms is just the game plus various little bits of DLC. If you spring for the physical version of Namco Museum on the Switch, you'll get Pac-Man CE 2 thrown in, which will probably cover you. So conclusions? Play the 2600 version for hilarity. Cry at the state of the original ports in general, but eventually play the Spectrum or possibly C64 ones. And for an arcade-perfect experience, play any late-era Namco Museum, but you'll find us on the Switch. Then give up on all of that, and realise that if what you want is the spirit of the experience of playing Pac-Man in 1980, if what you want is a 2019 equivalent of the arcade experience you would have got walking into your local arcade and playing Pac-Man for the first time, if what you want to do is feel like you're playing Pac-Man in a real arcade, then go spend the £8 to £12 depending on DLC that Pac-Man CE costs to see the original creator pour 2.5 decades of love into his most recognised work before walking off into the sunset, his legend status assured. It's the nearest thing to a mic drop gaming has ever had. There's probably not a person watching this video that didn't somehow grow up with Pac-Man. If you did but haven't played it in a few years, then do yourself a favour and pick up whatever version is available for whatever you do your gaming on now. The muscle memory will come straight back as soon as you hear that music. And raise a glass of your modern energy brew gamer beverage of choice to Toru Iwatani, a man who changed the world. There's one more name we should mention, Masaya Nakamura, who in 1955 formed a company called Nakamura Seizakusho to make rides for children. The company later became Nakamura Manufacturing Company, and then, finally, Namco. It was Nakamura who led the company into the fledgling arcade business, and he who after the Pac-Man debacle suggested the name Pac-Man. He led Namco right through the arcade and console eras, eventually retiring in 2002. He died in 2017, aged 91. If you've ever played Pac-Man, Ridge Racer, Tekken, Pole Position, Xevious, Soul Calibur, Galaxian, Rally X, Rolling Thunder, Splatterhouse or Time Crisis, raise your glass a second time. Then go play Pac-Man. Toodles.